Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome along to our June policy update. We'll be beginning very shortly. We've just opened the meeting and we know there's a number of people that are trying to get into the meeting, so we'll give them a couple of minutes to arrive. So beginning very shortly. Hello, good afternoon to those of you that have just joined us. Welcome along to this policy update for our farmers involved in the Sustainable Incentive Pilot and Tests and Trials. We will be beginning very shortly. We can just see there's a couple of people that's still waiting to get into the meeting and trying to get in. So we'll just allow them to enter and then we'll be beginning within the next couple of minutes. Thanks everybody for waiting. Hello, good afternoon to those of you that have joined us. We can just see there's a couple of people just waiting to get in, so we'll just let those in and then we'll begin very shortly indeed. Thanks for waiting, everybody. We've still got numbers creeping up, but we are past 2 o'clock and we've got an hour with you. So I think we will begin. Well, welcome along, everybody. For those of you that haven't met me before, my name is Louise Maguire and I am in the Tests, Trials and Sustainable Farming Incentive Pilot team. So today we're going to give you a brief update on the announcement that we made last week. So just a bit of housekeeping before we begin. So as you'll be aware, today is a webinar. So you will hear us and the panelists that's here this afternoon, but you won't be able to see each other. And that's just because we've got a lot of information that we want to get through. The good news though is that if you do have a question, you can use the Q&A button to submit it. So for those of you that are not familiar with Zoom, if you just go and you're on a laptop or a computer, you should be able to go to the bottom of your screen. There should be a Q&A button. Please do wait to submit any of your questions until a bit later into the presentation, because what we found with early webinars is that people begin asking questions, but actually we've answered them as part of the presentation. So I will give you a moment before we begin the Q&A just to review it and see if your question's already in there, and we'll try and get to it. We will try and answer as many questions as we can, but there may be some questions that we can't answer or we may need to take away for you. So please don't worry if that's the case. We will take those away. We can't answer specific questions today for particular agreement holders. So if you do have an agreement, whether it's a pilot agreement or you may have another agreement, but what we'd advise is that you email either the pilot learning team or, if applicable, the Rural Payments Agency, and the email address is there if you haven't. And what we would say is there is more information coming soon, but we'll indicate where that is as we go through the presentation. If you are struggling with any of the webinar functions today, please let us know in the chat and my team will we'll reach out. Thanks for the feedback already for people that have placed some things in the chat, but we will, if you are struggling to hear, just let us know and we will try and reach out and help you. So what did we want to do today? So the purpose of today is that we did make an announcement last week, and what we wanted to provide you with is just an opportunity to hear from us, an overview of what was in that announcement, and it mainly focused on the Sustainable Farming Incentive offer that we'll have in 2023. We wanted to take you through the actions that we've published and the payment rates. And we wanted to let you know how people with, if you have a pilot agreement, or for example, you have a countryside stewardship agreement, how you can access the offer, the SFI 23 offer. So we'll be going through that and what it means for you. Then at the end, we'll pause and we will take as many questions as we can. And I'm sure we'll have some time remaining. If we go to the next slide, please. Thanks, Liz. So hopefully everybody can see that slide. So what did we announce last week? So the SFI offer is about to expand. So last year, as you remember, for those of you that may have entered into a Sustainable Farming Incentive Agreement in 22, we introduced 3 standards covering soils, 2 covering soils and 1 covering the moorland. But this year in 2023, we are going to expand that offer to a full range of 23 actions. And we want to do with these actions is support farms, food production and the environment. And what we did last week on Wednesday was we published all the scheme information in the form of a standalone printable handbook that is on gov.uk. And what we'll do is we'll put a link into the chat so that you can see, you can click on the link and that'll take you, if you haven't seen it already, to the handbook. So what does the handbook actually have in it? It has full details of the actions that is going to be available in the 23 offer. So this includes full finalised versions of the 19 actions. So some of you may remember that we held some webinars back in January, in the beginning of February, to take you through those 19 actions. And it just contains the final versions of those, along with details of 4 new soil standards to replace a moorland standard to replace the SFI 22 standard. So we're not taking those forward quite in the form that we had them in the 22 offer, and it just explains what we're doing in 23, but we'll take you through those a bit later in the presentation. And it also confirms the final payment rates. The handbook also contains information on stacking and co-location of 23 actions. So what do I mean by that? I mean, if you've got a scheme already, so if you've got a pilot agreement or you've got a countryside stewardship agreement, it tells you what actions in the 23 offer you can stack on top of your agreement. And it also tells you how the management payment will work. As you remember, we announced this back in January, but Sam will take you a bit through that a bit more later on in the presentation. It's got updated terms and conditions in there and everything you need to know on the actions and the scheme rules. So it's a really handy book to have and to be able to download. What we are keen to do is have a smooth transition from SFI 22 to 23. So one of the things that we did last week was announce the temporary closure of applications for SFI agreements, which took basis with immediate effect. And why have we done that? Well, it's part of our process for getting ready for the expanded offer to make sure that we've got all of those actions available. But what we didn't want you guys to do is to enter into a 22 agreement when very shortly you're going to be able to enter into an agreement with those full 23 actions, and it'll mean that you have access to that full offer and benefit from that offer. What we will be doing later this summer from August is reopening the application windows, but in a controlled rollout. So those of you that applied for an SFI 22 agreement may recall that this is we did a very similar thing with SFI 22. We're developing the application service to make sure that it's as simple as possible for everybody to apply, and rolling it out in a controlled way means that we're able to offer the right level of support and service to everybody. So during the initial phases, this means that you may be able to apply via the Rural Payment Service online, or you may be asked to contact the RPA so that they can support you with your application. It is likely that if you do contact the RPA in August, when the window opens, that you won't be able to apply immediately, and we'll need to wait in a bit of a holding pattern for a very short period until we get the system fully up and running and we've fully tested it. I just wanted to make a note on vet visits. So the temporary closure of the SFI only applies to environmental land management agreements and not the annual health and welfare review. So that will continue unaffected. So if there were any of you that were thinking about making an application in the next couple of weeks, I'd still encourage you to look at that and make that application, because you can still do so and get that vet visit. What we'll do in August is publish more information, and this is just really the final pieces of scheme information. So for example, there'll be a little video on how to apply and some guidance that you can refer to, a bit like what we did for SFI 22. If any of you came along to our regional pilot events last year, we showed that video there. And there'll also be some voluntary how-to guides to show you some of the things that you may want to do to fulfill the actions in 23. If we move on to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to touch on the key features of the Sustainable Farming Incentive. What we're hoping is that it gives farmers more freedom to choose how to complete the actions without lots of prescriptive rules. So we have tried to make the scheme more flexible. So what does that mean? You have the freedom of choice over what combination of actions you can choose. So unlike the pilot, where there is a series of actions that you have to do, there are standards, but there's groups of actions under each of the standards, and you can do one or you can do all of them. It's up to you. It's pick and mix. And you are now able to stack multiple actions, i.e. do them on the same area of land, subject to compatibility and double funding rules. So that means you can co-locate different actions on different land parcels. So you may wish to do something on hedgerow management alongside something somewhere on integrated pest management, and you can do that. And that enables you to maximise the amount that you can earn from the SFI scheme and fit it alongside your other farming activities. I just wanted to make a note on the test and learn approach, and this is very much the approach that the programme is still taking, and the pilot is still a very important part of that, as is tests and trials. So last year we learned from the pilot and from tests and trials about the importance of having a simpler application, about shorter guidance and improved terms and conditions. And what we've done this year is learned from that to introduce as much flexibility as we possibly can, so you have flexibility to choose what you can do. In terms of eligibility, SFI will be open to farmers who are eligible for the basic payment scheme. The land must be wholly in England and eligible for the actions. Farmer must have management control over the land for the duration of a 3-year agreement period. However, if you are a farmer on a short-term rolling tenancy, you can enter if you expect to have management control for 3 years. And if that changes during 3 years, just let us know and you can leave without penalty. In terms of applications themselves, you can decide how much of your land you may enter into the new scheme. So there's no minimum or maximum area. So you may wish to put your whole farm holding in or just part of your holding. Applications will be online and they're rolling, so you can apply at any time of year. And what we were experiencing with the SFI 22 is that farmers were applying during 1 month and the agreement was set live on the 1st of the following month. So agreements were being processed quite quickly at the start. Another important point to emphasise is that applications are not competitive. If you and your land are eligible, you will be offered an agreement. So it's something else for you not to worry about. So as I mentioned before, agreements will last for 3 years, and the good news is that you can upgrade each year, a bit like you can in the pilot. So we have in the pilot the annual change period, and we've also, due to the success of that, we've introduced that into the main scheme, and you can upgrade, and that may be to add more actions, or it may be to add more land into your agreement each year. A note on payments, so very similar approach to what we've tried and tested within the pilot. So the annual payment will be made in quarterly instalments. So you'll be expected to receive your first instalment on the 4th month after your agreement start date. So it doesn't have any capital items alongside the SFI scheme, but you can apply for other capital offers. So for example, the Countryside Stewardship offer. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about this later on, but you can have land in both the Sustainable Farm Incentive and other schemes. But again, I said we'll take you a bit through that. So before we go into the actions themselves, I've just got one more slide about the outcomes that we're looking for. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So the mix of actions we're introducing will contribute to the government's targets for environment and climate change. And I'm sure you all know what those are. Those come from the Environmental Improvement Plan that was published this year. And just to give you an indication, some of them include that we're seeking to get between 65 and 80% of land managers adopting nature-friendly farming by 2030 on at least 10 to 15% of their land. We're looking to improve the GB Red List by 2042 and increase tree canopy cover, just to name a few examples. But we think that this will help us increase uptake by farmers because of the simple pick and mix option, allow us to achieve a range of environmental benefits and outcomes, and support you in delivering productivity for your sector. So right now, I'd like to hand over to Sam in my team, who is going to take you through the SFI actions in more detail. Sam.
Thanks, Louise, and afternoon to everybody. So as Louise said, I was going to take you through the sort of details of the actions, and I'm just going to run through them relatively quickly because the majority of the actions are still the ones that that we published earlier in the year in January. But we have made some tweaks to them and we've finalised some parts of them. So I'll take you through those details. But just in summary, as you can see on this slide, the offer for 23 for SFI in 2023 is based on 3 sort of main areas. So we've got the set of land management actions, which are grouped together through the sort of standards themes there on the left-hand side. We've also got some additional payments that we make through the scheme. So we've got the SFI management payment, which will be applicable to all agreements subject to eligibility. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute, and also the common land additional payment, which is something that we've already been offering in the existing scheme, the scheme for 22, but that's being brought forward. And then the third element, which as Louise touched on earlier, is the annual health and welfare review. And whilst that doesn't sit directly in the SFI 23 environmental land management scheme agreement as such, is a separate standalone agreement, it does form part of the sort of SFI offer for 2023. So it's still there and still running through. And again, I'll touch on that shortly. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll just start to go through the actions that are going to be available for the offer. And we're going to start off with the soil actions. As you can see, we've got 3 soil actions available for this sort of current year, and they've been pulled through from the offer for last year. And so looking down the list, we've got the soil assessment and testing soil organic matter and management plans, the multi-species winter cover crops, and then the herbal lays. So those are what we have on offer on a soil perspective this year. And for any of you that are maybe familiar with the current offer for the full scheme, you'll notice that there are several actions there that that we had last year which haven't been brought forward, and those are adding organic matter, which was in the introductory level of the arable and horticultural soil standard, the single species winter cover in the same standard, the arable and horticultural, and then the minimising bare ground in the improved grassland. So we're not bringing those through this year into the offer for 23 because those three actions relied on a sort of a percentage cover of the whole sort of land and the whole set of land parcels that you bring into the scheme. But because for this year, to make it more flexible, as Louise was explaining, where you can pick the actions you want to do and the amount of land that you want to put into those actions, then the sort of a percentage of a whole land parcel or a whole farm doesn't work in the same way. So we haven't been able to bring those forward currently sort of in the current plan. There are, however, a number of other sort of actions that are available through the sort of wider set of actions for the offer that will also have sort of dual benefits, so benefits for what we're asking to do, but also benefits for the soil. So things like the IPM2, the companion cropping, legumes, and overwinter and pollen and nectar flower mixes, and the buffer strips will also all have benefits for the soil health and cover over the winter period as well. So we've been looking at where where we are still able to provide those benefits, but from a slightly different perspective. So those are the soil actions. If we move on to the next one, we've got the moorland action. So this again will apply for land above the moorland line as it has done in the current scheme. And effectively, we're bringing forward everything that was in the 22 offer into a single action. So there were three specific actions within the current moorland standard, which we're going to combine into one. So assessing the moorland, assessing the vegetation, the soil type, and the public goods and the potential. So that's just really rolled into a single action which covers all different elements, the three different elements, and the payment rate reflects that, and there's also an additional payment per agreement for moorland on the same basis, recognising the sort of additional work that goes into keeping that agreement together in those types of areas. So that's the moorland one. Then we move on to hedgerow. So this is the first of our sort of new set of actions for 23. And so we've been doing quite, feeding in quite a lot of the pilot work into this, and there's been some practitioner group working groups, which I know some SFI pilot agreement holders have also been part of. So the actions here are, we've got three actions under the hedgerow sort of standard theme in terms of assessing hedgerows and their condition, managing hedgerows in different ways, and then maintaining or establishing hedgerow trees. So you'll see with all the actions that we're running through, they've got a 3-letter and a digit code along the left-hand side, so HRW 1, 2, and 3 here. And those are just to help identify the actions. So when we're referring to actions within the scheme, it's easier to identify those. And for those of you that have got experience with countryside stewardship, you'll know that we have a similar code, but it's just 2 letters and a digit. So we've made the SFI ones 3 letters just to make that differentiation as to when we're talking about an SFI action or a countryside stewardship option. The HRW2, sorry, just before we move on, sorry, the HRW2, just to note, the management one is quite similar to the countryside stewardship B3 action. So it does include sort of similar activities, although through SFI we've widened out the eligibility. So through SFI it can also include Cornish and Devon hedges, which is slightly outside of the current scope of the CS option B3. So if we move on to the next one, we've got our integrated pest management action. So again, I think as we said in January, this again is one of our sort of new areas and a new area from our very original sort of plan for the scheme. And we've got 4 actions here. The first one is looking at a plan, so or creating a plan, and that would be a sort of a basis qualified advisor to create a plan, and it's a payment per year per sort of SFI application. So it doesn't sort of matter about the amount of land that you've put into the application. That would be on a single basis and would cover the farm. So that's a sort of single one, and then the IPM 2, 3, and 4 are then based upon sort of how much you want to put in per hectare. So we make a payment per hectare, and then you specify how much you want to put in. And as we've been saying, this year for the offer, you can pick and choose which one of the actions. So you may just want to start with IPM 1. You might have the ability to put all 4 actions in, but it's entirely up to you which actions you want to pick for your agreement, and certainly for the first year of your agreement, because you can always change that at your first anniversary as well, and how much land you want to put into them. So moving on to the nutrient management. So again, similar sort of similar principle this. So we've got a single nutrient management plan and a review report, and that would be a sort of a fax qualified report. So again, we pay on a sort of per agreement per year, on per application, and then the 2 actions, and there are the legumes on improved grassland and a legume fallow. So those are the 2 options depending upon your land types and what you're doing. So then we go on to the farm wildlife actions. So for those of you that are in the pilot and familiar, these are our land standards. So we've got the arable and horticultural land and the improved grassland land standard. So again, the mix and match, and we brought these through as we sort of planned to, and as we said earlier in the year. So there were three there for on the arable and horticultural land options, and then 2 further ones for improved grassland. If we move on to the next one, we've got the buffer strip actions. So these do form part of the wildlife land actions, but we've just split them out because it's just it's useful to be able to see them sort of separately. And again, through the pilot, lots of you will know that we've been trialing a number of different buffer strips in different standards within the pilot. So through the hedgerow, through the land standard, through the water body buffering. But for the SFI 23 offer, we're running 2 or a single sort of buffer strip option, depending upon the land type, which is then creating between 4 and 12 meter grass buffer strips. And it's sort of up to you where you put them, how much you put in, and obviously you work out the area, and then we make the payment per hectare based upon that. So that's how the buffer strips will work in the offer going forward. And then just the final one to run through in terms of the actions is the low input grassland action, and this is the one that we have sort of tweaked and updated and finalised since the January publication. So we've effectively got one action here, but it's split between 2 land types, so land within the within SDAs and land outside of SDAs, and there's some slightly different management requirements within the action, which you can get more details of in the handbook. But the significant point to note is you'll see that the payment per hectare is the same, because that's as a result of a lot of the work that we've been doing on the sort of uplands and FDA areas, and we've now equalised the rates so that we're paying the same. We've increased the rates based upon land in SDAs, so that they receive a higher rate than they have done in the past, to recognise the complexities of farming and managing that land. So that's a low input grassland management payment. So I mentioned the management payment before, and we said in January we'd be applying a management payment to the SFI scheme, which is to recognise the fact that we know that it does cost you to be involved in the scheme, to sort of to apply, to maintain the agreement, to hold the evidence, to be ready for a site visit. So we're adding this payment onto agreements, and it's going to be based on an area, so up to the first 50 hectares that you would put into an agreement for all land-based actions. So that does include the moorland action, where you're assessing the land and assessing the vegetation and soil types, but it won't apply to the 2 planned actions, so the IPM1 and the NU M1 standards, because they're sort of per farm on a single basis. But everything else, including the hedgerows as well, where it's played on a linear basis, percentage basis it will include, and it's £20 a hectare for up to the first 50, as I said. So you can therefore get up to £1,000 per farm business. The other point to note on the management payment is that it will be paid for one SFI agreement per SBI, because it will be possible for you to hold more than one SFI 23 agreement on an SBI if you so wish, but we would always calculate the management payment on the first one, the one that started first, and that's what you would be paid on. But for those, again, those of you within the pilot, your pilot agreement is outside of that because you receive your pilot participation payment through that, so it's not linked. So your pilot agreement doesn't count as that first one. It would be your first SFI 23 agreement. So that's the management payment. And then I've just got a couple more sort of areas I wanted to touch on. So common land, as I mentioned when we were talking about the moorland standard, common land can still stay within or is eligible for SFI under the single agreement basis. So we can only have one agreement for common land. So it's got to be a collective agreement that includes all the interested parties. So that could be graziers, commoners, and landowners together. And so to help with the cost of administering that, because we recognise that there is more work involved in getting that sort of single entity together and maintaining that, we pay an additional amount of £60.15 per hectare, and that's being brought forward or brought through from the current offer as well. And as long as there's at least two people entering into that single agreement, then that payment will be applicable. And then finally, as I said earlier, the annual health and welfare review still forms part of our SFI offer, albeit on a sort of standalone contract. So we're continuing this. We started our controlled rollout of this part of the scheme earlier in the year, back in February, and we've scaled that up. And so, and these are still, providing the cost of a vet visit or sort of a vet-led team to carry out an annual review and look at particular areas of livestock. And you have to, certainly in the current sort of way we're running it and building the scheme, if you've got sort of multiple classes of livestock, then you need to pick which one you'd like to for the review to cover. So, and of the list as noted there on the slide, which is exactly the same. So we haven't changed that. That's just a continuation. So those are the sort of basis of the payments and how the scheme, what the offer is made up on. And what I'm going to do now, I'm going to hand back to Louise, who's just going to take you through what this means for those of you that have got SFI pilot agreements.
Thank you very much indeed, Sam. So in terms of the pilot, what does it mean if you already have an agreement? So the pilot is a live scheme and you will be continuing to deliver your existing standards in your agreement. So this doesn't mean that the pilot is going to come to a premature end. The pilot will still continue for the 3 years of your agreement. And the full range of pilot standards are still available to all of you that have pilot agreements in the 3rd and final year. So if during your annual change period, that'll be coming up very quickly for some of you, if you want to add in more land to the pilot or increase your ambition level, you can still do so at your annual change period and across those 8 standards that we have in the pilot. As I said, the pilot is still a really important part of our test, learn and adapt approach, and the learning that we have is proving invaluable to help us shape where we go with our new schemes. And because of this, what we are going to do in the 3rd and final year of the pilot is maintain the pilot participation payment at the same rate as years 1 and 2 at the flat fee of £5,000. So for those of you that do have a live pilot agreement, you will be getting the £5,000 split between your quarterly payments during year 3. And we're really pleased to confirm that to you today. As well as learning about the delivery and effectiveness of the standards, the pilot is allowing us to test at scale and look at how we can we can refine the different schemes. And it's also an important part of helping us understand about the actions themselves and how they are delivering the environmental outcomes that we're looking for. And we know that from speaking to you on some of our farm visits that we've been on, that you're looking and recording perhaps the increased biodiversity, the birds, the wildlife that you're seeing as a result of what you're doing. And we're just really keen to hear to see and to hear that feedback, which is a really important part of our learning and elements that we go into. And as a result, we've had things like the practitioner working groups that you've been involved with in our co-design groups. So, and that will continue throughout the pilot for us to gather learning both from tests and trials and the pilot. So if we go into the next slide, please. So how can you join SFI as a pilot farmer? So you will be able to access the Sustainable Farm Incentive offer in 23 when it becomes available, if you wish to do so. So these are the things that you need to keep in mind. So your land must be eligible. And if your land isn't in a pilot agreement, you can enter it into 23, and that's completely fine. If your land is in your pilot agreement, you can still enter it into the 23, subject to you and your land being eligible, and also that the activities and outcomes you're being paid to deliver in each scheme are compatible with each other. So you're not being paid, and you're not being paid for doing the same thing twice. So we're going to take you through that in a moment through the next slide. So the next slide just takes you through some of the compatibility of the actions. So some of the actions can be located on the same parcel of land as all of the pilot standards, as there are no compatibility or double funding issues. So these are fairly straightforward, and in the first box that we've got on the slide there. So those Act 23 actions are IPM1, so producing a pest management plan, NUM1, assess and producing a nutrient management plan, and HRW1, assessing the hedgerow condition. Just to note, however, the first two of those actions, producing the plans, don't attract the management payment, as it's not area or length based. The second box indicates that there are a number of other actions in the 23 offer that have selective compatibility with the standards that's already in the pilot and you may be delivering. So just to give you a brief example, the first one in the box there, SAM1. So, and this is for soil assessment, producing a soil management plan and testing soil organic matter. It's eligible with all of the pilot standards other than the arable and horticultural and improved grass and soil standards, as you would expect, because you're already delivering that type of activity, so it will be duplication. There are some other actions in the 23 offer that have limited compatibility and can only be located on land parcels that have the introductory level of the SFI pilot hedgerow standard, but full details can be found on compatibility in the handbook, so we'd encourage you to have a look in the handbook. What we will be running when we announce, when we publish further information on the opening of the application portal, what we will be running is some sessions for our pilot farmers to come along, and we'll be taking you through compatibility in a little bit more detail to help you make your decisions about what you can and can apply for. But helpfully, what my team have done, if we can just go on to the next slide, is just this shows you at a high level the 8 standards that we've got and what can be located on the same land parcel or along the boundary of each parcel as each of the pilot standards. So we will circulate this presentation afterwards and you can have a look at that, but please don't worry, that's also in the handbook. We've just put it together all on one slide for you. So I just wanted to touch on stacking SFI pilot and SFI agreements. So just to make you aware, a common question that we've had is, can I only do this during my annual change period? So if you do opt to have a 23 agreement, it will be a totally different agreement to your pilot agreement. So your pilot agreement will run and you can add things into that based on the 8 standards that we've in the pilot. If you choose to take out a new SFI 23 agreement to run alongside your pilot agreement, then you will get a separate agreement. You may wish to have a think about the start dates for your pilot agreement, and if you want to run them concurrently, you can do so, but if you choose to do a different day, that's entirely up to you and what works for your own farm business. You can be eligible for the SFI management payment as well as the SFI pilot participation payment. Just be cautious though that there are two actions that don't attract that management payment, the two planning actions. So just be wary of that. And again, just what I've highlighted in the other slide, we will be running some sessions to take you through the detail and the compatibility, but we'll advertise those widely when we put those on. Go to the next slide, please. So amending your pilot agreement. So we'd like as many of you to stay in the pilot if you wish to do so. It's adding to the weight of evidence that we've got and helps us in our test, learn and adapt approach. But if you do want to amend your pilot agreement, you can do so. And there's a couple of ways you can do this. The first, as I've mentioned before, is during your annual change period at the date your agreement enters its third year. So you can make changes. And you won't have to repay any money if you choose to take standards out of that agreement, as long as you've delivered the actions within that standard for year 2. However, you can decide if you did want to come out of your pilot agreement, you can do so at any point in your agreement term, but I just wanted to make you aware you may have to repay any part of the year's payment, including the pilot participation payment. So that's just something that you'll need to be aware of if you're thinking about amending your pilot agreement and taking standards out of that so that you can go into SFI 23. And what I'd like to do now is just have a couple of slides left that take you through if you have a countryside stewardship or an SFI 22 agreement that Sam's going to take you through. Sam.
Thanks, Louise. So we know, although we've got a number of pilot participants on the call today, some of you've also got countryside stewardship agreements on other land. So we just wanted to take you through the sort of process for that and some of the principles. So as we've said before, and as we said in January, instead of developing a new scheme, which we talked about, the local nature recovery scheme, we're going to keep countryside stewardship running, and we're going to build out the existing countryside stewardship scheme to include some of the things that we were looking at for local and nature recovery. So particularly things like spatial prioritization and how we can sort of allow farmers and land managers to collaborate and coordinate with each other to benefit under the scheme and to benefit for the environment. So because we're going to keep those running, we want to make sure that we can also keep this offer sort of open to as many of those in agreements as possible. So if you've got land in a CS agreement, or you're going to apply, or you're thinking about applying for a CS agreement or a mirror agreement, you can also enter the same land into the SFI 23 offer as well. So which will be a case of, as in sort of stacking those agreements. But as we've mentioned before, and as per for the pilot, it is subject to the principles of sort of being compatible. So, the actions that you want to do in your SFI agreement being compatible with those that you've got in your existing CS or the CS agreement you're thinking of applying for. You've got to meet the eligibility criteria, of course, and also that we're not paying for the same things or the same outcomes on the same land at the same time through both schemes. What we've done in the handbook is we have tried to make it quite clear for each of the SFI 23 actions which options, CS options, are compatible. So if you have a look at the actions you're interested, so if that's HRW2 or IPM4, for example, it will tell you from the other schemes which options are compatible with that. So it gives you a pretty good idea at the first sort of glance as to where you can co-locate and stack. It may well be, because we've tried to make the SFI 23 offer sort of as flexible as possible, that it may be that although you can't necessarily co-locate the two 22 on exactly the same piece of land, you could still put it in other areas within the land parcel if that's allowed. So if if you've got a 10-hectare land parcel and you've got 4 or 5 hectares in, say, a CS option, which is not compatible with one of the SFI actions, you may well still be able to put it on that land parcel, just as long as it's in a different part of the land parcel. So we are trying to make it as flexible and as easy to stack agreements as possible. And then just moving on to the SFI 22 agreement. So I know Louise has touched on this before, but what we want to do is to make sure that all of those sort of people that have signed up early to the Sustainable Farming Incentive, the early adopters, so like in the pilot, that they can also benefit from the sort of flexibilities and the changes that we've brought into the 23 offer, because the standard sort of process, the sort of single standard with a number of mandatory actions in 22 is less flexible, and we've heard feedback. We've obviously been hearing feedback from lots of you in the pilot, but we've heard feedback from farmers in that have either applied for the and have a 22 agreement or have wanted to apply, that they wanted more flexibility. So we are going to allow those that have got 22 agreements to transition into the new style sort of agreement. And what we've done is we've written to everybody that's holding an agreement at various stages of that process to explain the process and how we will sort of work that transition process through and allow them to move across from the 22 agreement style and into the 23, and also what we're going to do about where in the soil standards that we haven't pulled through some of those actions, the sort of percentage actions that I explained earlier on. So that's all in train, and that will be undergoing, particularly once we get sort of the application window open for the SFI 23 offer later this summer. And just the last point, just to mention about the 22, the management payment. So I sort of went through the management payment, but we had originally said that this management payment will be applicable from the 1st of January this year, and that will still be the case. So if people have got SFI 22 agreements running already, you're still sort of generating eligibility for that management payment. If you had an agreement that started before the 1st of January this year, so i.e. from when the 22 offer opened in at the end of June last year, then your management payment is effective on a pro rata basis from the 1st of January. Or if you started a 22 agreement type agreement since the 1st of January, then the management payment is effective from the date that your agreement started. So that you're still generating that, you'll still be eligible for that. What we do have to do to be able to actually pay the management payment, the pro rata sort of amount, we do have to sort of update the terms and conditions of those 22 agreements. So anybody that has got one of those agreements will also be written to ask them to agree to an updated set of terms and conditions so that we can make the management payment. And I think the current plan is that we're hoping to start making those payments later in the summer. So just want to reassure people that you won't lose out on the management payment even if you've got that agreement. So you'll be pleased to know that that's the end of the presentation from Louise and I. There's quite a lot of information to assimilate, and hopefully throughout the time we've answered quite a few of the questions. We've also been trying to answer some questions in the Q&A as we've gone along. So if you put a question in and you can't see it, do check in the answered section, because it could well be in there already answered, and obviously everybody can see those as well. But Louise, I don't know, we've got a bit of time, so hopefully we can answer some questions.
Excellent. Yes, thank you very much indeed, Sam. So if I can encourage everybody to just have a look over the Q&A section, and if your question isn't in there, please take the opportunity to pop it in there. As Sam said, please do read over. I think there's 19 questions being answered, and you can see the tabs that you can, if you open the Q&A that says one says answered, that you can have a look at, and you can see the questions that have already been answered, and thanks to the team that have been busily answering those. So just to cover off a couple of the high level questions that we've got already. So one, people are saying it would be really nice to have a hard copy of the handbook, and we've had that feedback. So we're taking that feedback back to our policy teams, and we are looking into that in a bit more detail to see whether that's possible or not. So we will come back to you on that one, but thank you very much for giving us that feedback, and I think there's quite a few of you that said the same thing. I think we've got a couple of people asking, wouldn't it just make sense to actually just have one scheme? And I think that is obviously at the minute we have a transitional period where we have the existing schemes, but we also are trying to deliver some new schemes. I think our aim is to have one scheme and one application portal that you can apply to, but obviously that is going to take us time to get there, to make sure that we have the full offer available to everybody. So that is definitely the aim, but obviously it is going to take us a little bit of time to get there. We wanted to get this offer of these 23 actions out to as many farmers as possible. So we've got a question again in the chat rather than the Q&A on the advantage of being in SFI versus CS mid-tier as the payment rates are the same. So I think that's a really good question. I think it really depends on you and your farm business and what's appropriate for you. So obviously there are a few key differences that you need to be aware of, in that SFI is for a 3-year period and CS mid-tier agreements are normally for a 5-year agreement. So it really just depends what works for you and your farm. And obviously you have the flexibility to add into your agreements at your SFI agreements during the annual change period, and you do get those quarterly payments. So there's obviously pros and cons, and depends what works best for you and your farm business. Sam, anything you wanted to add to that one?
No, I think the other thing just to be aware is that with the SFI scheme, one of the key principles of SFI is we've been trying to design it without the need for additional advice, and so that all the information that you need is there within the sort of like the handbook, the supporting guidance, etc. Whereas with CS and the model that we've been using, working with CS, some of the actions are more complex and do require a sort of more sort of thought and planning behind them, and some do require advice as well. So that's why we've sort of got the 2 schemes, so that we can offer sort of together between the 2, that we can offer that sort of range of different sort of options and activities, for people that want to just get on and do it themselves, don't want to have additional advice, and some where they perhaps want to take a bit more time and a bit more advice and think about it, and look at perhaps some sort of longer and wider ranging types of activities on the farm.
Thanks, Sam. Sam, I think I've got a question for you here from Sue. We already have our hedgerows within our pilot agreement. Are we now able to add our hedgerow trees, which we maintain, to the pilot agreement?
So if you've already got hedgerows in the pilot, then when you come up to your annual change period, that the tree action is already in the pilot. So there are different degrees of that. I think it's the sort of frequency of trees per 100 meters, and that changes with the level of ambition. So if you want to change that level of ambition within the pilot, then you can do that. But because that's already a pilot standard, if you've got your hedgerows in the pilot, then you wouldn't be able to stack the hedgerow action, the 23 offer on top of that. But what is available for those that have got hedgerows in the pilot is the HRW1, so assessing the condition, because that's not a standard that or an action within the standard that we have in the pilot.
Thanks, Sam. We've got a question from Tracy here that's quite a technical question, so we may have to take this one away. Are Lig 1 and Lig 2 payments for SDA and non-SDA land also matched in CS mid-tier?
So I can perhaps try and answer that in terms of if I interpret it right. But yes, we have looked at the payment rates in Countryside Stewardship. So the payment rates that we use for where we've made the differentiation in the SDA, non-SDA have been reviewed in Countryside Stewardship as well at the same time. And that was part of our work that we were doing on the uplands and how we can support the uplands and the management of those areas.
Thank you very much, Sam. We've got a question from Joe here, and it's around start dates. If we start a 23 agreement on top of our pilot agreement when our pilot ends, and for them it will be March 2025, will we have a gap from, say, September 23 when we have to wait until September again to add extra stuff that we couldn't have before then because we were in the pilot, but will have ended before then? So it's a really good question, Joe, and I think you need to have a think about your, if you want to enter into 23 agreement, what's the best time for you to enter it into? I think there's a couple of things I want to say before I hand over to Sam, see if he's got anything to add. So you can go into a 23 if there's things that you are worried about in the pilot, you could opt to take them out of the pilot, or you could have a 23 agreement, not add them in, and as you say, add them in during the annual change period. You can also have 2 SFI 23 agreements, but what you need to be aware of is it's only the first one that will attract the management fee. So if you haven't got the management, it's just the first one that will attract the management payment to your agreement. Sam, was there anything else that you wanted to add to that one?
Thanks, Louise. Yeah, no, I think I was just going to mention about because you do have potentially the ability to stack 23 agreements, so you could run one and then run another one as well to just to pick up that gap. But I think we are talking to sort of our policy colleagues and operational colleagues as to how we can transition pilot agreements across as well, whether that be into new agreements or if you've already got a full SFI scheme agreement running alongside. So there's, although we are sort of approaching that time, we're still sort of halfway through the pilot at the moment. But we're at that sort of point where we're starting those discussions and to understand, what the process will be for all of you that are in the pilot as we get towards the last year.
Thanks, Sam. Sam, we've got another question that we may not know the answer to, so we have to take this away. So it's somebody that's just started a CS agreement and wants to know if there's an opportunity that they can come out of CS because they'd like to enter into SFI.
Yeah, so again, I think that one, I don't think we could say we'll take back and get the answer, because I think we're still working through. I know it's a vision of the scheme and the way that we're developing the schemes that you would be able to move between schemes. And I think we have this overall view of trying to have sort of one scheme eventually where you'll be able to have a selection of, say, for example, different SFI actions and CS options. So you'd have different terms and conditions for those, but within one agreement. But I know it's sort of an aim and an objective for people to be able to move between schemes as long as you maintain or increase the environmental sort of ambition and outcome of the scheme collectively. So if you were coming out of one to go into another to do more and to increase that, then we want to try and enable that. I don't think we're quite there with the scheme development at the moment. So I think that if you were going to withdraw, it would need to be a sort of an individual discussion with the RPA as to how to do that. But what we are trying to do is trying to make it easy for you to run them alongside. And the SFI agreements are for a 3-year period, but then they will, the plan is that they will then be able to renew. So you'll be able to renew, and you have that flexibility to be able to look at it at each anniversary to make amendments and put more land in, or different actions at the anniversary, which is obviously not currently a feature of CS at the moment.
Thanks, Sam. We've got some feedback. I think this is more feedback from Julie. So Julie, thanks for your feedback about there being a huge policy gap for improved grassland, either in or out of SDAs. And I know you've put in the chat that you are quite disappointed about the upland grassland opportunity. Obviously, we did make an uplands announcement where we've announced that we have equalised some of the rates. So now some of the SDA rates are the same as some of the non-SDA rates. So there are things that we have introduced. We've introduced the SFI management payment as well that will allow, as Sam took you through during the presentation, will help you offset some of those costs of being in and administering a scheme. But really happy, Julie, if you have any feedback in terms of how we might be able to help, please do email us at our email address and we'll take that into account. Question here from Caitlin, Sam. For the options that require reports and plans, can these only be applied for the first year, or can this be received year on year?
Thanks, Louise. So no, as far as I'm aware, it's a year-on-year payment if you enter into that, because you will need to maintain those plans and update them, sort of accordingly throughout the period of the agreement. So that is an annual payment, not a single agreement payment, but it does apply. You can't sort of, you won't be put, it's not sort of one where you can put sort of extra hectareages in each year, because it's just a payment for doing that activity on the farm, you know, per year. But you can also obviously, and you don't have to deliver actions as well. So for IPM, for example, you could decide just to select the IPM 1 plan action, and you don't have to do 2, 3, and 4 as well. Obviously, the payment rates are then commensurate about what you choose to do, but you know, you can just select IPM 1 or NUM 1 if that's what you wanted to do.
Thanks, Sam. We've got a question from Julie. I think this relates to the pilot standard, but you may be able to correct me here, Sam. Are the SFI improved grassland standards still available for new applicants? So if you are referring to the pilot standard is only available still to those of you that have a pilot agreement. So if you have an existing pilot agreement and you have the improved grassland, then you can increase the amount of improved grassland that you've got in the agreement during the annual change period. If you haven't got it in your agreement, you can add it during your annual change period. Sam, anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think that's that. If we're related, if we're meaning the SFI pilot standards, then yeah, that's exactly correct.
Thanks, Sam. And then finally, we've got one more question left. So please do have a look at those that have been answered, because the team have been busily trying to answer as many of your questions as we possibly can during the time that we've got available. So we've got one left from Robert. Is there a payment proposal for reducing inorganic nutrient input of NPK fertiliser, similar to the payment for eliminating insecticide usage?
Thanks, Louise, and thanks, Robert. So that's a really good point, and I know there's lots of work being done around that and thinking about that. So I think for the current offer, it's not included in where we are at the moment. But as we've sort of said, and as we said earlier, this is the offer for 2023, and what we're trying to do is to sort of build the scheme and get the scheme sort of accessible to as many farmers and land managers as possible in the sort of the best sort of timescale that we can. So I think it's not that for the future we wouldn't be looking at some of those areas, but we're trying to balance, as Louise said earlier, we're trying to sort of balance in terms of the outcomes, the attractiveness, the complexity, the number of things that we're asking people to all do at the same time. And it's just getting that balance between all of those at the moment. So I think that proposal's not there, but it's not to say something along those lines might not be considered at some point in the future.
Thanks, Sam. We've just got a few more coming. I know we're mostly at time, but we'll just try and answer these questions and then we've got through them. So we've got one from Julie. I asked to add land into my pilot agreement last year and was turned down, told I could have a new agreement only. Has this changed then? So Julie, I'm not sure why that's the case, but I suggest if you could contact the SFI pilot learning team, and we will be putting our email address up, and just give us the details of what you tried to do, and we'll follow that for you, Julie. Thanks for that. And if you could include your SBI number, that would be really helpful if you know it as well, and then we can trace it down really quickly. Thanks, Julie. We've got a question from Tracy. So this is about Sam 3. Sam, about the herbal layers. It doesn't seem to say what a herbal layer should consist of, like the CS option. Is there more detail somewhere? So I think this is a really good question, Sam, but I think this is where we've tried to have that flexibility, but I'll let you answer that.
Thanks, Louise. So yeah, so we will be publishing a bit more information for the for the scheme and the actions as we get some of the how-to guides will be coming out closer to when the application window is opening later in the summer. But essentially we are, there'll be some guidance in terms of what a herbal lay could consist of, but we are trying to keep it as wide and flexible so that as farmers you can choose what you do to produce that herbal lay and how that how that works for you on your farm or your particular situation. So we're trying to reduce the prescriptiveness where we can. So
we've got we've had one more question came in, and then we'll draw to a close. So I'm not sure if we can answer this question. It seems to be but I'll repeat it, Sam. So this is from Jonathan. The extra payment for floodplain grassland and blocking up ditches isn't in the new scheme for low input pasture. Will this come back in at any point? So I'm not sure whether, is that related to countryside stewardship?
So I think it could be it's the management. So we've got the two actions within the low no input are sort of managing grassland with very low in nutrients, so again there are sort of various management actions that you need to do, and so what we've decided to take forward are the actions that we know are working well and have the sort of least sort of complications and complexity, and some of the feedback that we've had from the pilot. Those of you that have been trialing that standard. So at the moment, as I say, we've brought forward the things that we know are going to work well in the scheme, and then we'll be looking at that. If we when we undertake a review of that particular set of actions, and also I think we mentioned in our publication we're looking at some of the other themed areas. So I know we've got ditches and boundaries and watercourses and those sort of areas. So just because it's sort of not in the current offer for 23 now, it's not to say that it's not going to be in a wider offer going forward. And as also we're looking at the CS options as well, as to where there are gaps in the CS options and where we can review those. So there should be provision for those somewhere coming up.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Sam. And I think that draws us to a close. So just a brief reminder that we do have the handbook. Please do click on the link that my team have put in the chat and go and have a look at that, as well as the blog. The blog's really helpful in setting this out. We are going to circulate the slides from today, so please don't worry if you have missed something that you'd like to refer back to the slides. We will be sending a link out to you. I just wanted to thank you very much for your time, for joining us today. If you do have a query that we haven't answered today, or a specific query about your agreement, please either contact us, and our email address is up there, or the Rural Payments Agency. We do have a quick poll that my team will just launch now, and this just helps us, gives us a little bit of feedback on whether you found the webinar useful today, and that helps inform whether we do future webinars and how we set up those webinars. So please take the time. Hopefully everybody can see that, and please take the time to fill that in before you go. Whilst you are completing that, just to say to everybody, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much to my team for doing a great job with the slides, but also for answering the questions. I think we answered all the questions today, which is brilliant. We hope you found the session useful. Liz, has everybody responded to the poll?
Not quite, but it's definitely slowed to a halt. So I'll end that now. Thank you ever so much.
Okay, thank you very much. And we shall see you all very soon. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a lovely afternoon.